I heard them decide my fate through a door that was not fully closed. It was a fate to be managed, a problem to be solved, much like a leaking roof or a sudden infestation of mice in the larder. My grief, it seemed, had become an inconvenience of a similar order. "She is a walking shadow, Thomas," my stepmother's voice, thin and sharp as a needle, pierced the heavy oak. "No man will look at Rosamond while Elara sits beside her, draped in black and sorrow. It is unseemly. It has been a full year." A full year? As if grief were a tenant whose lease had expired and could be summarily evicted with a sternly worded letter. My father's reply was a low rumble, the sound of a man weary of complications. "What am I to do, Beatrice? She is my daughter. She is Arthur's widow." "She is a reminder," Beatrice corrected, her tone implying this was the greater sin. "A reminder of misfortune. We need celebration. We need light. We need Rosamond settled. The Duke of Alastair owes you that favour." I pressed my forehead against the cool, painted wall of the corridor, the floral pattern an indifferent witness to my dissolution. The Duke of Alastair. The name was a monolith in society, a man carved from granite and silence, widowed himself years ago and said to have sealed his heart in the same tomb as his late wife. He was not a man known for his charity, and the notion of his estate being used as a repository for unwanted, grieving daughters was ludicrous. And yet, the conversation continued, a grim bartering over my future, and I understood. I was not to be a guest. I was to be exiled. My marginalisation had not begun with my husband's death. It had only been cemented by it. I was the first daughter, the plain one, the quiet one, a muted watercolour sketch next to the vibrant oil painting that was my sister, Rosamond. Where her laughter was a cascade of bells, my smile was a rare, hesitant thing. Where her hair caught the sun like spun gold, mine was the colour of dusk. Arthur, my late husband, had been a kind man, a gentle scholar who had appreciated my quiet nature, but his passing had returned me to my father's house as damaged goods, a piece of porcelain that had been chipped and was no longer fit for display. My black bombazine dresses were a constant reproach to the bright silks and optimistic pastels of the London season. I was a failure of presentation, and in my family's world, presentation was everything. The catalyst, then, was this house party at the Duke's country seat, Blackwood Manor. It was the event of the season, and Rosamond was intended to shine. My presence was a smudge on the pristine canvas of her matrimonial prospects, so I was dispatched ahead of them, sent away under the flimsy pretext of needing country air to restore my spirits. I travelled in a plain carriage with a single trunk, feeling less like a guest and more like a parcel delivered to the wrong address. The manor itself rose from the mist-shrouded hills like a fortress, its stone walls seeming to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It was a house that kept its secrets, and I felt a strange, bleak kinship with it. I, too, was a house of shuttered rooms. The Duke of Alastair was precisely as society described him. When he greeted me in the cavernous main hall, his presence seemed to lower the temperature of the room by several degrees. He was tall, with a severe beauty that was more arresting than handsome, his features sharp and uncompromising, his eyes the colour of a winter storm. He was a man defined by his high status and the palpable aura of his own grief. A grief so old and settled, it had become a part of his architecture. He looked at me not with welcome, but with a brief, dismissive assessment, as if confirming the contents of a delivery.
"Mrs. Finch," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that held no warmth. "My housekeeper will show you to your room. Dinner is at 8.
He did not offer his condolences. He did not ask about my journey. The exchange was complete. He turned away before I had even formed a reply. I was an obligation, a debt being paid, and he had no interest in the currency. The first few days were a study in invisibility. I kept to the gardens and the library, a ghost haunting the edges of the burgeoning house party. I saw the other guests arrive, their carriages a parade of wealth and ambition, their laughter echoing in the halls where I walked in silence. I was an anomaly, a quiet note of discord in their symphony of social manoeuvring. At dinner, I was seated at the far end of the long, polished table, a strategic placement that rendered me conversationally inert. My father and stepmother, arriving with Rosamond in a flurry of silks and excitement, barely acknowledged me, their focus entirely on positioning my sister within the Duke's line of sight. The meeting, the true meeting, happened on the third night. It was a grand affair, the dining room ablaze with candlelight that glittered on silver and crystal. I was seated, as usual, in social Siberia, beside a deaf old baronet who spoke only to his soup. The conversation flowed around me, a river in which I could not swim. My stepmother, holding court near the centre of the table, was recounting a witty anecdote when her gaze fell upon me. A small, tight frown marred her perfectly powdered face. "Ilara, dear," she called out, her voice carrying down the table with practised ease, silencing the nearby chatter. "You must try to be more cheerful. It does no one any good to dwell so. This is a party after all." The sudden attention was a physical blow. 100 pairs of eyes turned to me, their expressions ranging from pity to morbid curiosity. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a tide of humiliation. My father, taking his cue, added his own weight to the assault. "Beatrice is right, Ilara. Arthur would not have wanted you to languish. It is time to put away the mourning, in spirit, if not in dress." It was an impossibly cruel sentiment, a public stripping of my right to my own sorrow. I looked down at my plate, at the intricate pattern of the porcelain, willing myself to disappear into it. And then another voice, colder and sharper than the rest, cut through the oppressive silence.
"Indeed,"
the Duke of Alastair said from the head of the table. His eyes were fixed on me, not with sympathy, but with an unnerving, imperious command.
"Your father is correct, Mrs. Finch. Stop mourning and smile for the guests."
The words were a public execution. He had not merely agreed, he had issued a decree, using his authority as host to validate their cruelty. It was a command to perform, to paint a smile over the cracks of my grief for their comfort. Not a glance, not the polite sweep of a host's gaze, but a direct, unblinking stare that pinned me to my chair. And in that moment, something inside me, something that had been dormant for a year, broke. It was not a loud shattering, but a quiet, clean snap. I did not know what I would do until I did it. Slowly, I placed my napkin on the table. I pushed back my chair, the scrape of its legs on the polished floor sounding like a cannon shot in the stillness. Without looking at anyone, not my stunned father, not my triumphant stepmother, and certainly not the Duke. I turned and walked out of the room. Each step I took down the long corridor was a revelation. I was not a parcel. I was not a smudge on a canvas. I was a woman who had just walked away from her own public shaming. I did not know where I was going, only that I needed sanctuary. I found it in the library, a vast 2-storied room filled with the scent of old paper and beeswax. The fire was low in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows over the spines of 1,000 silent companions. I did not weep. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside me. I simply stood in the centre of the room, breathing in the quiet, feeling the first tremor of an unknown strength. Then I heard the heavy door click shut behind me. I turned, my heart seizing, expecting a footman or perhaps my furious father. It was the Duke. He stood by the door, a tall, severe silhouette against the dark wood. He did not speak. He simply watched me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. The silence stretched, thick with the unspoken words from the dining room. I expected an admonishment, a demand for an apology for my breach of etiquette. Instead, he walked slowly toward the fireplace, his movements measured and deliberate. He picked up the iron poker and stoked the embers, coaxing them back to a gentle, flickering life. The gesture was so mundane, so strangely domestic, it disarmed me completely. "My late wife," he said, his back still to me, his voice a low murmur that seemed to be pulled from the very stones of the house. "Loved this room. She said books were better company than most people. She found people to be performative." He replaced the poker and turned to face me. The firelight caught the sharp planes of his face, illuminating a profound weariness in his eyes that I had not seen before. "What I said in there was unforgivable." It was not an apology, not in the conventional sense. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same cold precision he seemed to apply to everything. But it was more than I had ever received from my own family. It was an acknowledgement of the wound. He had seen my defiance, and in following me, he had seen something more. He had seen me. That night marked a subtle but seismic shift. I was no longer invisible to him. The next morning, he sought me out in the breakfast room, a place I usually visited only when it was nearly empty. He did not join me at my small table, but paused on his way out. "The East Garden has a remarkable collection of winter roses, Mrs. Finch," he said, his gaze direct. "They are surprisingly resilient. You might find them of interest." It was not an invitation, not quite, but it was a clear signpost. Later that day, I walked the path to the East Garden, and he was there, ostensibly inspecting the espaliered fruit trees. He fell into step beside me, and we walked for nearly an hour, chaperoned only by the skeletal branches of the winter trees. Our conversations began to fill the empty spaces of my days. We spoke, not of our shared widowhood, but of books and landscapes, of crop rotation and architectural follies. He was surprised, I think, to find I had opinions on such matters, that I had read Gibbon and Locke, that I understood the principles of estate management from helping Arthur with his modest property. He listened with an intensity that was both unnerving and deeply validating. I felt like a parched plant being watered for the first time in years, my thoughts and ideas unfurling under the warmth of his focused attention. He was not making polite conversation. He was engaging with my mind. My family watched this developing rapport with a mixture of confusion and alarm. The Duke was supposed to be paying court to Rosamond, with her beauty and her carefully rehearsed wit. Instead, he was spending his time with me, the sombre shadow. One afternoon, as we sat in the library discussing a particularly dense passage of philosophy, I shivered, an involuntary reaction to a draught from the tall, mullioned window. I thought nothing of it, but he noticed. His eyes flickered to my thin shawl for a moment before the conversation continued. That evening, when I returned to my room, a package lay on my bed. It was wrapped in plain brown paper with no card. Inside was a shawl of the finest cashmere, the colour of deep moss, thick and exquisitely soft. It was an anonymous gift, yet I knew its source as surely as I knew my own name. It was an act of quiet, secret kindness, a gesture that spoke more loudly than any flowery compliment. He had seen that I was cold, and he had provided warmth. It was as simple and as profound as that. The act wove a thread of intimacy between us, a secret shared in silence. The charged moments began to accumulate, small sparks in the quiet atmosphere we had built. Standing before a large map of the duchy in his study, he pointed out a line of ancient oaks, and his fingers brushed against mine. The contact was brief, accidental, yet a jolt went through me, sharp and startling. I drew my hand back as if burned, and when I dared to look at him, I saw a flicker of something in his storm-grey eyes, a raw, unguarded emotion that was gone as quickly as it appeared. We stood there for a long moment, the air thick with everything we were not saying, the silence a living thing between us. It was in that study a week later that he breached the wall of formality that still stood between us. He had been showing me a first edition of a book we had discussed, his voice low and animated. "You must call me Alistair," he said suddenly, his gaze holding mine. The request was a seismic event. In our world, the use of a Christian name was a declaration of profound intimacy. "Your Grace," I began, faltering. "Alistair," he repeated, his voice softer now, yet insistent. "I should like you to." The words were a key turning in a lock I had not known was there, opening a door into a new, uncharted territory. I began to feel a fragile, burgeoning hope, a sense that perhaps the winter of my life was beginning to thaw. But hope is a delicate thing, easily crushed. My father, displeased by the Duke's misdirected attentions, insisted I sort through the last of Arthur's papers, which had been sent along with my trunk. It was a tedious, sorrowful task, a journey through the remnants of my former life. And it was there, tucked inside a worn leather-bound journal, that I found the document. It was a letter written in my late husband's elegant script, dated just 2 months before his death. It was a confession of a catastrophic gambling addiction and a debt of a staggering sum, a sum that had threatened to ruin us completely. The creditor to whom he owed this impossible amount was named at the bottom of the page, a signature I now knew well. The Duke of Alistair. The world tilted on its axis. The floor seemed to fall away from beneath my feet. Every moment of the past few weeks replayed in my mind, now tainted and grotesque. I was not a guest. I was not a woman whose mind he found interesting. I was collateral. My presence at Blackwood was not the result of a favour. It was the cold, hard term of a financial negotiation. My father had sent me here to be dangled before his creditor, a pawn in a desperate game to settle his son-in-law's debt. the shawl was not a kindness. It was the act of a man maintaining his asset. The conversations, the shared walks, the intimacy of his name, all of it felt like a meticulous, cruel deception. He had been inspecting the quality of the payment due. The humiliation I felt was 1,000 times sharper than what I had endured in the dining room. This was a betrayal that cut to the very core of my nascent self-worth. I did not hesitate. I walked, letter in hand, directly to his study, my heart a cold, hard stone in my chest. I did not wait to be announced. I opened the door and found him standing by the window, looking out at the rain-swept grounds. He turned, a flicker of welcome in his eyes that died as he saw my expression. "Mrs. Finch," he began, his voice laced with concern. "Ilara, what is it?" I said nothing. I simply walked to his desk and placed the letter upon the polished mahogany. He looked from my face to the letter, his brow furrowing. He picked it up and read it, his expression hardening into an unreadable mask of granite. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drumming of the rain against the window panes. When he finally looked up, his eyes were dark with a complex emotion I could not decipher. "You know," I said, my voice brittle. "You knew all along." He did not deny it. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes. The debt was the initial reason for your father's proposal that you visit. The confirmation was a physical blow." "So, all of this," I gestured vaguely around the room, at the books, at the space that had become my sanctuary. "It was all a charade? A performance for the benefit of the debtor's widow?" His jaw tightened. He took a step toward me, but I held up a hand, warding him off. "Do not," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. He stopped, his face a torment of conflicting emotions. "The debt," he said, his voice low and rough, "was the arrangement. It was business. Everything else. You were the catastrophe I did not plan for." The words hung in the air, a desperate, unbelievable plea. Before I could voice the torrent of doubt and anger swirling within me, he turned to his desk and unlocked a small, ornate wooden box. From it, he withdrew a legal document tied with a ribbon. He did not hand it to me. He placed it on the desk beside my husband's letter. "I had my solicitor draw this up 3 days ago," he said, his voice strained. "I was waiting for the right moment to... Well, there is no right moment for such things, is there?" I stared at the document, my eyes blurring. It was a deed of acquittance, a formal, legally binding instrument forgiving Arthur's entire debt, in full. The date on it was from before I had found the letter, before this terrible confrontation. He had done this already. He had done it for me. "I could not stand the thought of you being tied to me by a transaction," he continued, his voice raw with a vulnerability I had never imagined he possessed. "I could not bear the idea that you might ever think my interest in you was anything but what it is." He finally moved closer, his gaze so intense it felt as though he were looking directly into my soul. "For years after my wife died, this house, my life, was grey. It was all duty and memory. I had walled myself off from everything. And then you came here,
carrying your own grief so quietly, with such profound integrity. I saw a reflection of my own pain, but I also saw a strength I had lost. He let out a long, shuddering breath. That night in the dining room, I told you to smile because I had forgotten how. I thought if you could, perhaps I might remember. It was a cruel, foolish thing to say, but every moment since, every conversation, every walk, you have unmade the man I had become. You have brought colour back into the grey. His confession was a torrent, washing away the foundations of my anger and doubt. I looked from the deed forgiving the debt to the raw emotion on his face, and I saw the truth. He had taken action to free me before he was ever discovered. His feelings were not a strategy, they were a complication he had embraced. I saw him then, not as the cold Duke of Alistair, but as a man, Alistair, as vulnerable as I was. In that moment, I accepted his declaration, not with words, but with a slow nod, a silent acknowledgement that passed between us. I was admitting to myself what I had known for weeks, that my heart, which I had thought buried with Arthur, had begun to beat again for this severe, complicated, and honourable man. We were no longer creditor and collateral. We were allies, and we both knew our battle was not yet over. The stage for our final confrontation was set for the annual Blackwood Ball, a glittering affair that filled the manor with music and the scent of hothouse flowers. My father and stepmother had arrived in their finest, their ambition radiating from them like heat. They were furious at the Duke's continued preference for my company, and were determined to force the issue, to finalise a match for Rosamond and settle my own unfortunate situation. I entered the ballroom on Alistair's arm, a deliberate and public statement. I wore a gown not of black, but of deep emerald green, the colour of new life. The moss-coloured cashmere shawl was draped over my shoulders. The collective gasp from the assembled guests was almost audible. My father cornered us near the terrace doors, his face florid with wine and indignation. My stepmother stood beside him, her smile a brittle, painted slash. "Your Grace," my father began, his voice overly loud, "I must insist we speak about my daughter. Her attachment to you is becoming the subject of speculation. We had an understanding." Alistair's expression remained impassive, his hand resting protectively on the small of my back. "Your understanding, sir, was with a debt. It was not with a woman's future." My father's face darkened. This was not going according to his plan. He decided to change tactics, to reassert his authority over me. "Ilara has a duty to this family," he blustered, gesturing to a pompous, leering viscount standing nearby. "Lord Bramwell has expressed an interest, a suitable match that would go a long way toward settling our affairs." He was trying to trade me again, right there in the middle of the ballroom, offering my hand to another man as if I were a horse at auction. It was the final, unforgivable insult. But before I could speak, Alistair held up a hand. "There are no affairs to settle, sir," he said, his voice calm and lethal, cutting through the nearby chatter and drawing the attention of those around us. "You speak of a debt. I believe you are referring to the one incurred by your late son-in-law." He produced a familiar document from his coat pocket, a copy of the deed of acquittance. "As you can see, that debt no longer exists. It has been forgiven in its entirety. Mrs. Finch is under no obligation to you or to me, or to anyone. He had laid the evidence bare, stripping my father of his only weapon. The surrounding guests murmured, their eyes wide with scandal and intrigue. My father stood, speechless and sputtering, his scheme collapsing around him in public ruin. And in that moment of silence, I found my voice. It was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it carried with it the weight of a lifetime of being overlooked. "I have mourned, Father," I said, looking directly at him. "I mourned a husband I loved. I mourned a life I had lost. But I am not my grief, and I am most certainly not your debt." I took a small step forward, away from the protective circle of Alistair's arm, claiming my own ground. "My future is my own to decide. You will not barter with it again." My father's downfall was swift and absolute. He stood there, exposed as a desperate man willing to sell his own daughter, his social standing evaporating before the eyes of the very people he sought to impress. My stepmother, for the first time, looked utterly defeated, her brittle confidence shattered. They were finished. Alistair offered me his arm once more, and as he led me away from the wreckage of my former family, a quiet strength filled me, a sense of profound and final emancipation. I had not been rescued. I had stood beside the man I loved, and I had rescued myself. Later that night, long after the last carriage had rolled down the gravel drive, and the music had faded into memory, Alistair found me on the stone terrace overlooking the gardens. The air was cold and clean, and the moon cast a silver sheen over the dormant roses. We stood in a comfortable silence, the turmoil of the evening settling around us. He turned to me, his severe face softened by the moonlight, his eyes full of an emotion so deep it left me breathless. "Elara," he murmured, his voice thick with feeling. He reached out and gently cupped my face, his thumb stroking my cheek. The gesture was infinitely tender. And then he lowered his head and kissed me. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was slow and deep and shaking, a culmination of every unspoken word, every shared glance, every secret kindness. It was the end of a long winter and the promise of spring. It was the final, beautiful resolution to a grief we had both carried for too long. Months later, I sat with my husband in the library at Blackwood, a fire crackling merrily in the hearth. My husband. The word still felt new and wondrous. A shaft of late-afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Alistair was reading aloud to me from a book of poetry, his deep voice a comforting rumble in the quiet room. The house that had once felt like a fortress now felt like a home. The silence that had once been oppressive was now a peaceful, shared intimacy. My hand rested on his, our fingers intertwined over the worn leather of the book. This was our new normal, a life built not on grand pronouncements, but on the steady foundation of quiet companionship and mutual respect. The loose ends of my old life had tied themselves into neat, distant bows. Rosamond, free from our parents' suffocating ambitions, had written to me from Bath. She had become engaged to a quiet country gentleman with a kind smile and a love for botany. Her letter was filled with a genuine, uncomplicated happiness for me,
a sisterly affection that had finally been allowed to flourish. Even Mrs. Gable, Alistair's formidable housekeeper, who ruled the manor with an iron fist, had given me her own version of a blessing. One morning she had met me in the hall and given a curt, almost imperceptible nod, a rare smile touching the corners of her lips. In the silent language of Blackwood Manor, it was a declaration of unconditional surrender and complete approval. I looked at Alistair, at the way the firelight softened the severe lines of his face, and a profound sense of peace washed over me. I had come to this house as a shadow, a problem to be managed, a woman defined by what she had lost. I had believed that my story was over, that the rest of my life would be a quiet epilogue written in shades of grey. But he had seen me in the crowded, glittering world that had always overlooked me. He had seen me for exactly who I was. He had not asked me to be brighter, or louder, or less sorrowful. He had simply made space for me to be myself, and in being seen, I had found not only love, but the strength to reclaim my own life, to step out of the shadows and into the warmth of the sun. I had come home.